Hi, today I'm going to talk about human behavior, responsibility, and a famous psychological study called the Milgram Obedience Study. Now, if you don't know me, I'm Mr. Shaw. I teach ELA 8 Advanced. Thank you for selecting my lesson today. All you really need to do for the lesson is pay attention to some of the movements through the lesson. I'll show you the videos that you might want to pull up on Schoology at various points in the lesson, and I'll explain where to find some additional information at the end if this is a topic that you're interested in. Before I get into the PowerPoint that goes along with the lesson, I want to try something. Some of you are at home and some of you are in person. Regardless of the room that you're in right now as you're listening to this, whether it's your bedroom, an office at home, or a full classroom, I'd like you to stand up. And forget the fact that no one else in the room, if you are in school, is standing. Consider standing up right now. So go ahead. Go ahead and stand up. I'll wait. All right, at this point, if you did, you can sit back down. Now, there are going to be a couple of different variations of this, but I'd imagine if you were at home by yourself, you would be a little more inclined to stand up if no one could see you than you would be to be in a classroom of people that were all sitting down. Now, it's worth noting and kind of understanding the idea that being told to stand up when everyone else is sitting down is asking you to essentially be a pariah in society. It's asking you to go out on a limb and offer yourself up as different than everyone else that's in the room. Now, the interesting thing about this, too, is I have a couple things working in my favor when I'm directing you to stand up. The first is I'm a teacher. The second is I'm saying that command with a degree of authority. You've been trained most of your life to pay attention to adults, to pay attention to teachers. But it's an interesting idea that that's just a little experiment in social behavior. You know, that deciding to stand or not stand based off of where you are and who's around you is an interesting way to start to think about social behavior, why people act the way they do. It's interesting that as we talk about the Milgram experiment today, when we talk about the Holocaust, I try to keep my students away from saying things like, here's what I would have done, or I would have fought back. Because what we see again and again in history is that's not true. The idea is people are not inclined to help their neighbors in need. People are not inclined to resist or go against figures that are positioned as authority figures. And the Milgram experiment looks at this idea. The first slide of the PowerPoint says, a substantial portion of people do what they are told, irrespective of the content of the act and without pains of conscience, so long as they perceive the command comes from a legitimate authority. That means that people are allowed to do things that exist beyond their moral compass if they specifically think that that command is being given by someone in a position of authority. So consider some of the following questions. And if you want to pause to think about these as I go through them, you can. But this would be something that if you were in the room with me, I'd chat to you about. Are human beings basically good or evil at heart? I think most 8th graders even have a sense of how they feel about this question, but it is one of those huge questions that we consider when we consider the notion of human morality. What aspects of a person's life shapes whom they will be or who they will become? Were all the Nazis evil? What does it take for seemingly good people to commit truly terrible acts? Is the possibility for evil in all of us? My apologies for the typo here. Obviously that should be possessive, but general information on Milgram. So Stanley Milgram is one of the foremost researchers in behavioral psychology, specifically looking at why people do what they do. I believe a lot of his body of work came from Yale University, but his parents were Jewish refugees in the Holocaust, meaning that they escaped Nazi-occupied territories, and he does have that Jewish heritage. So the idea of the Holocaust was a very important idea to Stanley Milgram, as it was to his family as well. His most infamous experiment deals with the limits of power of authority. Milgram was interested in studying the Holocaust. Why would seemingly normal people commit horrible atrocities? It's interesting that when one of the major escapees of Nazi-occupied territories, a famous Nazi named Adolf Eichmann, when Eichmann was captured, some of the Israeli Special Forces agents that captured Eichmann commented on the idea that Eichmann was not a monster, he was a man. So how do you take a man or woman for that matter, and put them in a situation where they are made to do detestable things. So, you're invited. Back in, I believe this was 1963, Stanley Milgram would have invited people from all walks of life to participate in a psychological experiment. Yale University, New Haven, you'll be paid $4, which was a decent amount of money back then, I suppose, plus 50 cents for car fare. He's looking for people, and his researchers are looking for people that came from all walks of life for this behavioral experiment. Factory workers, city workers, laborers, telephone workers, white-collar workers. Really, he wanted a cross-section of Americana, a cross-section of American society. So here's what participants were told. They would show up to his Yale office ready to work and ready to participate in their experiment. And they were told the experiment is designed to test the impact of punishment on memory. Now, if you don't remember all this or understand all of it, I guarantee to you that everything will be made clear throughout the lesson. There are two participants that show up. They've never met one another. One participant is assigned the role of teacher, and one is assigned the role of learner. Participants will be randomly assigned their roles, where they draw essentially from a hat, either learner or teacher. They don't get to pick. One participant draws the role of teacher, the other draws the role of learner. This is going to be repeated a little later on if you don't get it the first time through. The teacher will read out a series of words to the learner. Seemingly unrelated words will be paired together. So the learner has to remember, based off the teacher's instructions, these random memory pairs. The teachers and learners are in separate rooms, and they communicate through an intercom system. For example, just to give you a sense of how nonsensical this is, the word dog is paired with shoe. If the teacher says dog, the learner, after studying 50 or 60 of these, has to reply with shoe. If the teacher says shoe, the learner has to reply with dog. For every pair the learner forgets, the teacher will administer increasingly severe electric shocks. The teacher receives a mild shock to give them a sense for what the shock feels like. So, a person in another room completes these word pairs and misses a bunch of them, and the teacher is instructed to shock them, to give them an electric shock, a little system that's connected from the unit in the teacher's room to a unit that's attached to the wrist of the learner. Shocks range from 50 volts to a potentially lethal 450 volts. Both the participants are in different rooms. This cannot be understated. But the teacher can hear the learner's cries as the learner is being shocked. Now, in the scale, we have slight shock 15 volts all the way to 450 volts. You see an XXX here to imply death. But there is danger that's written along this as it continues. So you get a sense for the varying levels of shock. Now here's the setup for the experiment, just to make it clear. The experimenter, who's typically a man or woman in a white lab coat, instructs the teacher to administer the shocks when the word pairs are guessed incorrectly, and this is the learner in a separate room. Now again, they can hear one another. If the teacher refuses to shock the learner, the scientist in the room asks the teacher to continue using phrases such as the following. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Now, how does this relate to the Holocaust? During the Nuremberg trials after World War II, it became a really popular defense called the Nuremberg defense that those Nazis that were being prosecuted by the military tribunal said they were simply following orders. This excuse came up again and again and again and again. Milgram was curious to see whether or not this was true. Could seemingly average people be asked or made to do terrible things based off of orders that they were given by someone that they deemed to be in a position of authority? It needs to be said, though, at this point in the lesson, this does not excuse Nazi behavior. Nothing in this lesson will. It does suggest, though, that how people react is a more complicated issue than simply the notion of born evil versus born good. So what's really being tested in Milgram? In an eighth grade class in 2021, I am not going to actually have you watch a video where people are truly administering electric shocks. Instead, we're being told to look at, or you're being asked to look at, the willingness of individuals to hurt someone that they've never met before this day, before this moment. How well individuals respond to those in positions of authority is being tested. Please note, And double underline this in your mind. No one is actually being shocked, but the participant thinks the experiment is real. The teacher believes they are actually shocking the learner, but the experimenter in the lab coat is an actor, and the learner is also an actor. Before we watch, make your prediction then. What percentage of people will continue to administer stronger and stronger electric shocks simply because a scientist is telling them to do so? Also consider, what would you do? What percentage of teachers will administer a slight shock, a mild shock at 15 volts? What percentage of teachers will administer a mid-range shock at 250 volts? What percentage of teachers will administer the full 450 volts to be leading us up to a potentially lethal electric shock? Milgram's colleagues predicted that 1.2% of participants would administer 450, the lethal amount of electricity on that board, 450 volts. So the video. The video is by a British illusionist and experimenter named Darren Brown. He's really famous in the UK. This is a modern version of the classic Milgram experiment from the 60s. I believe this version came out in the 2000s. The findings were near identical to Milgram's. As you watch, be very aware of your own reaction to what's going on. Pay attention to the people in the video and how they react as well. And ask yourself, how would you react in the situation? Now, where can you find this video? If you go to the human behavior folder that's on the Light Center page that you've been navigating through, you'll want to click on Milgram video with edit Darren Brown. This will take you to YouTube. If you prefer to download the video, you can find it where it says Milgram video with edit Darren Brown. But right now, take about 10 minutes to watch the video. Find it in one of these two places in the human behavior folder. Pause my video, and let's come back and talk. All right, don't continue this video unless you've already watched the Darren Brown study that I directed you to. But here's the idea then, and here's a chart to kind of explain everything. The percentage obedient was not 1%. It was 65% of individuals in the experiment were obedient to dangerous levels of electricity. You know, the intense shock, 5 were willing to go to the intense shock, 8 were willing to go to the extreme, 1 went to the severe, 26 participants. 65% of the total number of participants went to the dangerous XXX 435 to 450 volts. Now, when you could actually hear the person's voice and them shouting, the number dropped slightly to 62% of people were willing to comply with the study. When the individual was in the same room and you could see them in pain or pretending to be in pain, obviously, no one was actually getting shocked here. 40% of individuals were likely to go along with it. Now, there was another version of the study where you had to touch someone's wrist on a rubber pad that they were wearing so the electricity wouldn't course to you. But you could feel them jolt. And only 30% went to ahead with the experiment. A lot went to strong shock, but you look at the numbers here being a little bit shifted. The peer study was another study that Milgram did, and he found that when the subject had 2 other people to make the decisions with, if they went along with the shocking, he or she went along with the shocking. If they stopped early, then he or she stopped early. So the result of the peer study is that if the individuals said we need to stop, the other 2 individuals said to stop, only 10% went on with the experiment. Now, this number, 92.5%, is staggering to consider. If both peers said, let's keep shocking the person, then that level of complicity is the highest among all of the groups. It's interesting that after the experiment and whenever the experiment was revealed, the true purpose of the experiment was revealed, different people had different perceptions of why they did what they did. The professor of the Old Testament, you can pause and read through this if you want, but essentially said that his belief in a higher power made him stop. It was man giving him the order, but it was a higher authority, God. I'm not saying yay religion or boo religion, but it's interesting that he referenced God here in why he stopped. An industrial engineer, he said, I'm an electrical engineer and I've had shocks before and you get really shook up. He knew what the shocks felt like, so he went to 255, which is still a bad shock, but he didn't go to the lethal 450 volts. A nurse went to the 450 volts. This might be a little surprising. We imagine people that are in the nursing field to be compassionate. We imagine them to be somewhat altruistic. We imagine them to have empathy for their patients. Now, if you want to pause and read what she said, that's fine, but I'm going to paraphrase it. She said she went along with it because every day she's expected to follow the orders that a doctor is giving her. So her job is reliant on her always deferring to someone in a position of authority above her. A water inspector? Now, he said that he was in the military. He went to 450 volts because he said that he's always been taught to follow orders. Well, I faithfully believed the man was dead until we opened the door. When I saw him, I said, great, that's great. But it didn't bother me even to find he was dead. I did a job. That's what the Nazis were saying. I did a job. I did a job. Milgram's reason for the experiment. The experiment originally took place shortly after the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann had been brought to trial. Milgram wondered, was it Eichmann and his accomplices in the Holocaust had mutual intent, and at least with regards to the goals of the Holocaust? In other words, was there a mutual sense of morality? Did all of them have this skewed sense of morality that became this common morality among themselves? Some additional points of discussion, or at least to consider with yourself. Were you surprised by what you saw? Ultimately, what connections can be made between this and the Holocaust? Again, it doesn't excuse Nazi behavior, but it shows you that most people are willing to go along with being put in a position of authority. You have these three major groups in the Holocaust: the aggressors, the victims, and the bystanders. The bystanders have the most power, but is also the easiest route to take is to simply do nothing. How did the video inform you in regards to human nature? What does this video say about day-to-day interactions? Can you possibly make a connection there? Do you think that the study were conducted where you live, the results would be different? The studies happen again and again through history, and Milgram's numbers at around 65% compliance have showed up again and again and again. What lessons, if any, can be learned in regards to this experiment and the role that peer pressure or speaking out against atrocities, whether they're global or local, in our lives? A few further facts. More people were willing to go all the way to 450 if they were allowed to tell someone else to push the button. The closer the teacher was placed to the learner, the less likely the teacher was to administer the shocks. And considering the Holocaust then, how responsible are Nazi soldiers? German citizens that did nothing, German citizens affiliated with the party. We're going to look at a few more social experiments, and I'll just show you where to find them. The first is the Ash experiment. The Ash experiment asks participants to line up this line with its peer on the other side. So you can clearly see here, Exhibit 1 is closest in length to A. In the Ash experiment, though, well, I'll have you watch it actually, but keep this background in mind. Some additional experiments to consider. There's a famous case of a woman named Kitty Genovese who was murdered called the bystander effect. There is the elevator experiment, and there is this idea of, Kitty Genovese goes along with the bystander effect, but when are we willing to help out those that seem to be in need? Watch these clips and see if you can find a link between the ideas we've discussed, these clips in the Holocaust. What can we learn from these ideas and experiments? Now, here's where you can find the clips. In the folder on Schoology, it says additional videos to watch and resources. If you click here, you can find these. Now, I posted them as Schoology files. If you prefer to find them through Google Drive, you can click this folder and this link. It takes you to the exact same documents a second time. I'm just saying if you're having trouble downloading them or you'd rather just stream them from Google Drive, you can find them here. Watch the Ash experiment and pay attention to what it says about social behavior and group dynamics. Then this is the first video that deals with the bystander effect. There's a news story, if you want to read it, about this poor woman named Kitty Genovese who was murdered in New York City. As a bunch of people heard this crime happening, they did nothing to stop it. And then there's a modern version of the bystander effect. When are people willing to help one another? Finally, there's this silly little video called the elevator experiment where we look at if you walk into an elevator and 5 people are facing the wrong way, would you face the wrong way just because everybody else is? But the idea is these other experiments speak to the role that human behavior plays in the decisions that we make, the role that group dynamics play in the decisions that we make. Just take some time to watch them. If you want to reflect on them afterwards in your reflection form, you can. This is pretty much the end of my lesson. But again, I'd recommend, if you were interested in the Milgram study, I'd recommend looking through some of these additional documents as well. I am a real person that exists. I am in room 122. If you'd want to come by and talk about any of these during the Holocaust Day, feel free to come and pop down. Again, thank you for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you got something out of it. And I hope this lesson, more than anything else, made you think.